Welcome to another episode of the Science Matter, a research podcast where we discuss science matters and emphasize that science really does matter. We are actually live in Cape Town in the Oceanography and Meteorology Conference, and with me I have Dr. Gregor. Correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Who is from NRF-SAEON, and I'll allow Doctor to introduce himself. Doctor, can you please introduce
Mpandulo,
yourself?
thank you very much. So my name's Gregor Feig. I manage the research infrastructure in SAEON called EFTEON, the Expanded Freshwater and Terrestrial Environmental Observation Network. And I think you may have interviewed a couple of my colleagues over the course of the day. So I'm a biogeochemist by training. I started my academic career at WITS doing microbiology. And I got really interested in plant microbe interactions and how they operated, and eventually moved into the soil and what was happening with microbes operating in the soil and how they started releasing gases from there. That's what I did my master's on, working on the long-term burn experiments in the Kruger National Park. And to be honest, it was probably just an excuse to go and spend some time working in the Kruger Park and digging holes in the ground, because that's quite a lot of fun. I did my PhD. I was lucky enough to get a DAAD fellowship to go to Germany, and I did my PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in a lovely little town called Mainz. That was looking at the production of certain atmospheric pollutant gases from soil as a microbial process. But I'd stopped looking at the microbes at that point and was just looking at the gas emissions coming from the soil. I finished my PhD and came back to South Africa, and I started working in the environmental consulting space, doing about 2 years there, doing specialist air quality consulting. You know, the background that I had from looking at gas emissions from the soil was similar to the same kind of gases that were being released from industry and vehicles and things like that. And I got into this modeling of air quality for air quality management, pollution management, industrial planning, health impacts, and that kind of work, which was quite a lot of fun. And I think I learned a lot in the consulting space. And then I moved to the South African Weather Service, first of all, to start working on air quality modeling. But I'm not actually that kind of a modeler. I'm not very good at that level of modeling. And then I moved to run the South African Air Quality Information System at the Weather Service. And I really fell in love with running instruments and observation networks. So we started running the national air quality monitoring networks in the priority areas in the country. And that was a lot of fun. Making sure the instruments work, making sure you've got your team of technicians that are out there, making sure that the data is working and it looks good and it's being processed and becomes usable. And you can really see the impact that comes from having these long-term observation networks.
Okay. When I was still trying to say, as an interviewer, and especially if we're having a conversation that we didn't prepare for, you always try to find that point that you ask. When I was about to ask about the soil, I had environment, and when I was holding environment, I had air. Like, there's a lot of things that you did and get involved in. What is your current research?
So currently I'm managing the EFTEON research infrastructure.
Okay.
And what we're trying to do there, and as you could see from my earlier discussion, my background is I've moved around a lot, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And what EFTEON is trying to do is set up an integrated, transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research infrastructure to support environmental science research in South Africa.
Okay.
And what we're doing is we're setting up 6 landscape scale research sites that we call landscapes. And in that, integrating a whole lot of different scientific aspects. So including meteorology and atmospheric composition, which is where some of my background comes in, but also I think you interviewed Warren at some point today.
Yes.
The work that he's been doing. We've got work around hydrology, so the amount of water, the quality of the water that's in the systems, how that might change. Biogeochemistry, which is really my field of interest, looking at things like the exchange of carbon, the exchange of nitrogen in and out of the terrestrial systems, and how that moves, how ecosystems breathe. Then we've got biodiversity. So is the vegetation, how's the biodiversity changing over time? Okay. And then finally, we're going to be developing a social ecological systems component. So you can see all these different things interact with each other. How the land changes impacts how people utilize the land, impacts what happens to the water, impacts what happens to the carbon exchange, impacts what happens to the climate drivers. And they all interact with each other in various directions. And that's what we're trying to, if not get a handle on ourselves, is to provide facilities for other researchers in the country to start working on getting a handle on and providing some of that basic data that we need for that.
So can you give me an example of a research that is done by your facility? Like, I cannot say the research can never be complete, it can always be improved. You're trying to solve this problem and this is what you found, and what was the problem and what were the findings or the solutions?
Yeah, so I think our approach is a little bit different. It's not really one problem, one kind of research question.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is set up platforms that can answer many questions,
Sure.
particularly with a kind of integration. So we've got observations which look at the carbon exchange and the terrestrial systems. So basically how much carbon dioxide is moving into the systems or is moving out. So you can start getting a long-term record of how the ecosystems are responding to things like climate drivers, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere as a driver, land use change drivers, and things like that. So you can start seeing how the greenhouse gas exchange
Yes.
is being impacted by these various things as we go through, and what those numbers of exchange, how much is being absorbed or being released from the land systems. And we can get an idea of what that's happening, and then we can feed that into validated models or remote sensing products or things like that that we can roll through. These, of course, we measure the carbon exchange, but we also measure the water exchange. And then with the other instrumentation that we're getting in the landscape, we can start tracking some of those things.
Yeah.
The whole point of what we're trying to do is to try and get as much integration in these questions as possible.
Yeah.
So within these sites, we'd have, the carbon exchange, we'd have try and get an understanding of what's happening with water, and then also try and link it with what's happening to biodiversity and to how people think about and utilize the landscapes. So it's not quite so much a research question, but it's trying to get these linkages between systems.
It's like we're building a web from here to here. This is what so far with all these dots, is there any progress? Are you guys seeing some progress?
So, Africa as a whole, the global south is a research scarce region and data scarce region. So we are providing some highly needed long-term data sets or trying to establish those. The data that we're producing is readily available. You can get that off the SAEON websites with just a DOI, and that facilitates open research and the work that SAEON is doing with that. And of course there are research questions which are coming through. So some things would be like PhD student who'd been working with me closely a couple of them have just finished. One of them was looking at the carbon exchange in the Kimberley region and how that changed over time. So what those seasonal cycles might be, what the interannual variability might be of that, how much carbon is being drawn down by these systems, and what is driving it. So how long your growing season might be, what the weather, the rainfall does to it, when the carbon uptake starts kicking off, and when it stops. So those kind of questions become quite important if you're trying to judge how carbon exchange happens across the continent, right? Another student of mine had been working in the northern Drakensberg. He's just finished looking at what happens if you have a change in your land cover to your stocks of soil carbon. So if there's an experiment in the Cathedral Peak region, it's been run for many years, where there's things like fire exclusion. So it's a long-term grassland, it's a natural grassland, highly species diverse, and there have been some experiments which had been put in at some point in the past. So at some point they thought they could put trees in, and that really did change the whole ecosystem processing. Water had reduced the amount of water going into the rivers, and they eventually stopped that project, and it became that research platform. Those experiments became really instrumental in defining South Africa's water policy. So now that was done in the 1940s to the 1960s, but we still got these research catchments in operation, and it really speaks to the value of long-term research, right? And now we've got, some of these catchments, they've been protected from fire. And because there's no fire coming through, you're getting some natural woody vegetation coming through. And one of the questions that this particular student was looking at is, what happens to your stocks of carbon? So as a mitigation measure to global change and the increases in greenhouse gases, is to try and find ways that the ecosystems can start taking up more carbon. And people have proposed putting more trees into our systems.
Yes. Yes.
The South African systems and a lot of the African systems are actually grassy systems, and they evolved and they're highly species diverse, and they adapted to being grassy systems because of fire. And if you take fire out, you start getting trees coming in, you get this woody layer that comes in. What happens to the total carbon storage? And what we're finding is that instead of the paradigm that we think is you have more trees, you store more carbon, is actually most of the carbon is stored in the soil. And as you change the structure from grasses to trees, you start losing your soil carbon. And that then becomes quite, you're losing your major stockpile, you're losing your carbon bank account. So this really does speak to the kind of management questions that one has. What happens, if you've got a driver saying that we should have more trees, but trees actually, they keep a little bit of carbon above the ground, but you lose what's in the below ground in the soil, you then have a big problem, right?
I'm sorry to disturb you. I thought when I'm breathing, I'm releasing carbon dioxide, and then the tree will take it and then I release oxygen. Are you saying it's not happening like that?
So trees do that.
Okay.
In the South African system, or in a lot of the African system, grasses do it better.
Really? So I must plant more grass than trees in my house.
You've got to plant the right things in the right place. So if you want,
interesting.
in your garden, and you need a tree to give you shade, and so you can sit under it and you can enjoy it.
So my next question would be: do we need more carbon dioxide in the soil?
So to mitigate the impacts of climate change, we need to start reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So there are ways of doing that. I think it's imperative that we start reducing the amount that we emit. So how much of those greenhouse gases get into the atmosphere. We've got to be very careful we don't have very much left before we start getting to the realms of major changes in our climate that will be very difficult to adapt to. So we've got to, on the one hand is reduce those emissions. And there are many policy approaches that can be done to reduce those emissions, preferably while trying to maintain people's quality of lives and sustainability and various other things. But then we also need to start thinking about ways to take that carbon out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere that's a little bit safer than in the atmosphere. And that might be things like restoring ecosystems so that they can function better, that they can start holding that carbon in the ground or in the vegetation or in the various aspects that might come through. And understanding and protecting places where that carbon does get taken up. So when you spoke to Warren, either this interview or
Yes.
I don't know where that is, he spoke about the carbon that's taken up in the southern oceans, right? And that links into this conference as well. So if you look at all the greenhouse gases that are emitted every year globally, only about half of those greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere. And then the other half gets absorbed either by the oceans or by the terrestrial systems, the land's vegetation systems. So if you can try and protect the places which are absorbing carbon and increase the carbon storage in some of these other places, that will help in reducing the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, which is what is driving climate change.
Okay. I don't know if it's related. Does this sound like global warming?
So global warming is one of the impacts of these changes in greenhouse gas concentrations, because they act almost like a blanket. These gases can hold heat inside the atmosphere. So it acts almost like a blanket that you just put this extra layer which traps some of the heat, and that's what is driving the increase in temperatures. But that is also driving changes in circulation patterns. And these are some of the questions that are being brought up in this conference.
Yeah. So if the right policies are not urgently put in place, what does the future look like?
So, we've had things like the Paris Agreement. Well, the IPCC has, I think, very strong evidence around climate change and what those impacts might be. We've got global agreements like the Paris Agreement on how to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And there's quite a lot of work around, what the impacts might be if there's a 1.5 degree change in global temperature or a 2 degree change in global temperature, and what those impacts might be on the functioning of society. And it becomes a lot harder to maintain the kind of societies and the kind of economic systems that we've got with these changes, these large changes in temperature that one would see, as the the very foundation of how our ecosystems and our support systems start struggling to keep up to the changes in temperature and rainfall patterns and various other things. So it is imperative that we try and reduce this as much as possible. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. G. The more I listen to you, the more I'm starting to get worried. And maybe sometimes you must have a society lecture where you teach the community about all these findings and the great work that you guys are doing.
Thank you very much.